Okay, here's the third of the three-part series for today's Ancient Civilization lecture for History of Women in Sport. This will be the quickest one. I know the other two were a little lengthy, but this will be the quickest one for you. So I just have a few things to talk about with the Roman ancient civilization and women and their role in sporting and recreational habits. What we know about Roman culture and women in ancient culture of Rome is that they really were much more restricted than even we saw in Greek and especially Egyptian culture, because women were regarded to be under the control or the guardian of a male. It could have been their father, it could have been a husband, it could have been a brother, an uncle, some relative, a male relative to the woman. We know they had to be under the guardianship of them. So women didn't have much autonomy at all in Roman ancient culture. We do know though that they much like the Greek women and Egyptian women weren't just relegated to the home where that was their primary role in society, was a domestic one and taking care of the home. They did get out and they were active and they did participate in activities, but also much like Egyptian and Greek cultures, they were very similar in that they were much more leisurely. They weren't overly aggressive in most cases, except for one, we're going to talk about in a moment. And they were activities that definitely they could have done individually for the most part. So we see instances of women engaging in ball games. This actually seemed to be a place where the Roman culture is where we see a lot of images of ball games. There seem to be many types that they engaged in. I'm going to talk about three particular ones here in a moment. But we also saw them swimming and running like the other cultures. We also saw this idea of a sort of like weightlifting or the types of activities that you would see if you went to like that kind of a gym, right? Like weightlifting, conditioning their bodies in that way. And those images are repeated through a series of what is known as the bikini girls. These date from the first half of the fourth century. These images of women in bikini-like clothing, attire, engaging in these various athletic activities, and we see, and you see in some of the images that you have through the PowerPoint and the readings, women using images that look like dumbbells, medicine balls. They typically have a little bit wider shoulders, a little bit more broad in physique, and so they're definitely doing some kind of weightlifting training activity. And this is a very common image that we see repeated, much more so in this society than in in either of the other ancient societies that we've already talked about. So we know this was particular to the Romans, and we know that this is something the Roman women definitely must have engaged in quite regularly because of the amount of images we see of this in repetition. And along with that, we also see them engaging in these various ball games. There's believed to be probably a half dozen to, 10 dozen. I'm sorry, half dozen to about 10 or a dozen of different types of balls: soft balls, hard balls, larger balls, small balls, and that they then engaged in these different ball activities. Three of them in particular that historians have found documentation of are listed in your PowerPoint. Harpastium is one of them, Trigon is the second one, and Expulsum Luderi is the third one. Harpastium is one where they believe it took place was used a small hard ball, and it was 5 to 12 players in kind of a rectangular field. Maybe something like a kind of a soccer type game. So maybe the early beginnings of a soccer type sport, American soccer, and Yeah, and so anyway, and so that's definitely one game that they see an instance of, in terms of repetitive images. Trigon was also a hard ball, three players in a triangular format. That seems, sort of logical with the name like Trigon. And it seems as though it was just basically a catch and pass game, passing the ball between that triangular format. And then Expulsum Luderi is believed to be kind of a present day handball. So they were using their hand to move a softball back and forth between competitors. So again, I mean, now starting to engage a little bit more with each other, but still not really team sport aspect, still more individualized, and again, still a little bit more like a leisurely type activity that they seem to have engaged in. Now, one component of the Roman ancient culture that we do see is drastically different from this leisurely, individual, low endurance type of activity are female gladiators. That there are clear artifacts discovered and found of them, which we come to call gladiatrices. These are the female gladiators, gladiatrices. And we get a sense from documentation about 663 BCE that Nero, and then after him Domitian and Severus, these emperors are the ones that implemented female gladiator fighting. And originally, the women that got into these gladiator fights were they would fight dwarfs, then they would fight other women, and eventually some of them did fight against men, and they fought against beast. But the majority of their fights were done against dwarfs and women, of course, because that was most acceptable to society, that they would not see women fighting against men, but would see them fighting against what appeared to be the same or a weaker type opponent. So the dwarfs, other women, etc. Certainly, it was believed that most of the gladiators that fought, so the gladiatrices as well, were recruited from, like, whether it was prisoners of war or slaves, or they were from a lower class society, and so through fighting and winning they received freedom. And so that was a very common outcome for people who would fight, and women were no different. This is where they would this is why they would engage in the fighting, one, to show their prowess and their ability, but also to gain freedom through engaging in the fighting and winning their selected fights. It didn't last very long. A couple hundred years later, about 200 CE, is when the female fighting ended. People really, in general, society couldn't handle watching women fight to the death. Couldn't handle watching women in that capacity. It didn't feel appropriate to women. But we do have artifacts and documentation of women gladiatrices, and Amazonia and Aquileia is one really well-known artifact that clearly demonstrates these two fighting women, female gladiators. It's a stone carving. There's actually an image of it in your PowerPoint, and it's also referenced and talked about in your reading, the article that is posted in your readings. So we know that this did occur, and this was an instance of fact that happened in the Roman ancient culture. And this, again, like I said, is a very drastic departure from what we up to this point have understood women to engage in, actual documented engagement in a very physical, raw activity, very highly competitive activity. And so it's a shift from what we have known women to be, their behavior to be accepted as, in terms of recreational and sporting habits. So so I wanted to make sure that you do get this distinction between the Egyptian, the Greek, and the Roman civilizations, where some of the similarities lie, where the differences occurred, in terms of how women were treated in general, and then what they did in terms of recreational and sporting habits. These are important. This is important background information to know, because I think you can already start to understand and see where that might have continued to influence societies moving forward in terms of what people felt like were more appropriate for women to engage in versus not engage in when it came to physical exertion, physical activity, competitive environments. And so, yeah, and so hopefully that does give you some good, a little foundation background to start with, going all the way back to ancient societies, because we gained a lot from developing cultures from our ancient heritage and across the board, right? And many things that we do in society, and so this is not really that different, and definitely worth having some base knowledge on. So hopefully you've enjoyed the first three parts of the lecture series for History of Women in Sport. You can obviously go back and watch these at any time. There is the one inquiry forum from the second part of this three-part series, so make sure you know what that is so that you can submit that when your first inquiry forum is due a week from, in 2 weeks essentially. So we'll see you next week for your next lectures.